I had just finished a client meeting when I called my mother for the second time that afternoon. Margaret always answered. Even when she was in the garden or making tea, she answered. Her phone stayed on the small table beside her favorite chair, loud enough for her to hear from almost anywhere in the house. That afternoon, it rang 6 times. Nothing. I called again. Nothing. I remember sitting in my car outside my studio, staring at the phone and trying to explain away a silence that did not feel normal. My mother was 78. She lived alone, but she was fiercely independent. She hated admitting when she needed help, and she wanted to remain in her own house for as long as possible. I was 15 minutes away, so I drove. I did not call Ethan on the way. At 27, my son had his own life, his own problems, and more than enough reasons to avoid another conversation with his mother. When I reached Margaret's house, the front door was unlocked. That was the first thing that frightened me. My mother locked that door every time she came inside. I pushed it open and called her name. The television was still playing in the living room. A cup of tea had spilled across the edge of the rug, leaving a dark stain near the coffee table. A lamp had fallen sideways, its shade bent against the floor. But my mother was not in the living room. Then I heard it, a weak sound from the hallway. "Evie." I ran toward the stairs. My mother was lying at the bottom. Her forehead was bleeding. One leg was twisted beneath her in a way that made me stop for a half second before panic took over. She was conscious, but she could not get herself up. Her hand moved slightly against the floor as if she were trying to reach for something. I dropped beside her and called 911. The dispatcher kept me talking while I checked that Margaret was breathing normally and could move her hands. I told her not to move. I kept one hand near her shoulder without trying to lift her. Then I noticed someone else. Ethan was standing several feet away in the hallway. My son. He was not kneeling beside his grandmother. He was not calling for help. He was looking at me. I asked how long Margaret had been there. He said, "Grandma fell." That was all. I looked back at my mother, then at him. He said he did not know how long she had been down there. He claimed he had just found her. I wanted to believe him. More than that, I wanted the entire moment to be ordinary and explainable. An accident, a bad fall, a frightened grandson who had frozen instead of knowing what to do. Then I noticed his phone. The screen was open to a banking app. It was not on a call to 911. It was not on a message to me. I saw a list of transactions before the screen went dark. I did not ask him about it. Not then. I knew the first job was keeping someone alive, not solving the mystery around her, so I stayed beside Margaret until the paramedics arrived. 2 EMTs came through the door within minutes. One knelt beside my mother while the other asked questions. Then one of them looked at both of us. "Who called 911? "I did." The EMT turned to Ethan. "Were you here when she fell?" Ethan did not answer immediately. There was a pause. Then he said, "I heard a noise." I remembered that pause more clearly than almost anything else that happened that day. Not because it proved anything. It didn't. It was simply a pause. My mother was lifted carefully onto the stretcher. Her face had gone pale, and the oxygen mask covered most of her mouth. As the EMTs prepared to take her outside, she reached for my hand. I leaned closer. She squeezed my fingers with almost no strength. Then she whispered 4 words. "He was here." I looked at Ethan. He was still standing in the hallway. I did not ask my mother to explain. I did not ask Ethan to defend himself. There was no time, and there was too little information for me to turn suspicion into certainty. So I followed the stretcher outside. The ambulance doors closed. Red lights flashed across the windows of the house I had known since childhood. I stood beside the driveway and watched my mother disappear behind those doors. For most of my life, whenever Ethan was in trouble, I had asked the same question first. Are you okay? I had asked it when he lost his first job, when his business began to fail, and whenever he needed advice or another rescue. That afternoon, I didn't ask. I looked at my son and asked the question that never occurred to me before. What happened before I got here? Ethan said nothing. And for the first time, his silence frightened me more than the blood on my mother's forehead. I stayed at the hospital until they took my mother into surgery. By then, the hallway had become quiet. The emergency department was full of ordinary sounds, phones ringing, shoes moving across the floor, nurses calling names. But I heard very little of it. I kept thinking about the 4 words Margaret had whispered before they closed the ambulance doors. He was here. Ethan was sitting several chairs away from me in the waiting area. He looked tired, worried even. Every few minutes he checked his phone, then looked toward the operating room doors. I watched him without speaking, and while I waited, I started thinking about how many times I had done exactly the opposite of what I was doing now. How many times I had seen Ethan in trouble and stepped in before he had to deal with the consequences himself. When he was 12, he lost the laptop I had bought him for school. He had left it in the back seat of a friend's car. By the time they realized it was missing, the laptop was gone. Ethan was upset. I remember him standing in my kitchen, embarrassed and angry with himself. I bought him another one. At the time, it felt like a simple thing. He needed a computer for school. I could afford it. I didn't want one mistake to become a bigger problem for him. I didn't ask him to replace it. I didn't make him save for another one. I simply fixed it. 5 years later, when Ethan was 17, he got into trouble at school. It wasn't something that should have ruined his future, but it was serious enough that the school gave him a disciplinary consequence. I went to the meeting. I spoke to the principal. I explained that Ethan was a good kid who'd made a bad decision. The consequence was reduced. Again, I told myself I was protecting his future. At 21, the problem was money. He had accumulated $18,400 in credit card debt. I found out when he called me late one night and admitted he didn't know what to do. I paid it. I remember feeling relieved when the balance disappeared. I thought I was giving him a clean start. What I didn't realize was that I was teaching him something else. I was teaching him that a problem could disappear if he brought it to me. At 24, Ethan came to me with a business idea. He had researched the market, he had a presentation, he sounded confident. I invested $75,000. I didn't hand him a blank check. I believed I was helping my son build something of his own. For a while, it looked like I had made the right decision. Then the business started losing money. Ethan borrowed more. He missed payments. He asked for help again. And I gave it. Every time I found a reason. He was learning. He just needed another chance. Those words became so familiar that I stopped hearing what they meant. Another chance meant another payment, another rescue, another problem he never had to solve himself. The hardest part was that my mother had seen it long before I did. About a year before Margaret fell, we were sitting together at her kitchen table. She had been watching me handle another problem for Ethan, and she finally told me what she thought. "You don't help him anymore, Evelyn. You rescue him." I remember getting defensive. "He's my son." Margaret looked at me for a long moment. "I know. That's why you have to stop." I didn't like hearing it. I told myself she was being too hard on him. Now, sitting in that hospital, I wondered whether she had been too hard or whether I had been too soft. The operating room doors remained closed. Eventually, Ethan came over and sat across from me. He asked if Grandma was going to be okay. I told him the doctors were working on her. That was all. I didn't hug him. I didn't tell him everything would be fine. For the first time, I didn't know whether saying that would have been kindness or another lie. Then my phone rang. It was Daniel Mercer, the attorney I had used for my studio's contracts and other legal matters. I hadn't called him about Margaret. He had called me. He asked whether my mother had recently signed any financial documents. I told him, not that I know of. His next words changed the way I looked at the entire day. Then you need to check. After we ended the call, I opened my laptop. I pulled up the documents I had access to and started going through them one by one. I wasn't looking for anything dramatic. I was looking for something ordinary, a signature, a date, a form I recognized. Then I found it. A new power of attorney had been prepared 19 days ago. I read the document once, then I read it again. The person named to act on my mother's behalf was my son, Ethan Hart. I looked across the waiting room. My son was still sitting there, staring at the operating room doors. My mother was still in surgery, and suddenly, the fall no longer felt like the beginning of the story. It felt like the moment I had finally noticed that the story had already begun. I read The Power of Attorney again after Daniel's call. 19 days earlier. Ethan's name. I could not make myself believe what the page seemed to suggest, so I did what I always do when something in a project feels wrong. I went back to the details. Daniel came to the hospital that evening. He did not tell me that Ethan had taken control of my mother's finances. He was careful about that. Not yet, but someone tried to create that appearance. He asked me for the original document, not a photograph. He wanted to know who had notarized it, who had witnessed it, when it had been prepared, and where it had been filed. Those questions mattered because the document was supposed to represent my mother's decision. If the process behind it was wrong, the paper itself could become evidence. I gave him everything I had. I kept staring at Margaret's signature. At first glance, it looked right. The shape was familiar. The first letter, the long stroke at the end, even the way she pressed harder on certain parts of her name looked like hers. But I had spent more than 20 years running an interior design studio. I had learned to notice small differences because small differences cost money. A cabinet drawn 2 inches off could change an entire room. A contractor's invoice could look ordinary until one line did not match the agreement. A change order could carry the same logo and still contain a detail that changed everything. I had looked at my mother's signature countless times. This one bothered me. The spacing was slightly different. One stroke seemed too deliberate. Another was missing the small hesitation Margaret always made before finishing her last name. I did not accuse Ethan. I told Daniel what I noticed. He arranged for the document to be reviewed by a forensic document examiner. The result was not the kind of dramatic declaration I had expected from television. There was no certainty, no simple sentence saying someone had forged the signature. The examiner described the signature as highly suspicious and recommended further investigation. That was enough. Not proof, but enough to stop me from pretending the document was harmless. Then Daniel asked about security cameras. My mother had installed them a few years earlier after a package disappeared from her porch. I had almost forgotten about them. We polled the footage. The first thing I saw was Ethan arriving at the house 2 hours and 11 minutes before Margaret fell. I watched the timestamp twice. 2 hours and 11 minutes. He had not simply appeared after the accident. He had been there long before it. A little later, Lauren arrived. After her came Richard and Helen Pierce, Lauren's parents. I knew them, of course, but seeing them on that recording made the house feel unfamiliar. Ethan went into my mother's home office. That caught my attention. Margaret kept her personal papers there: bank statements, insurance records, property documents, tax files, things she did not leave lying around. I kept watching. Before Ethan entered the office, Margaret was walking normally. She moved slowly, but she was steady. She carried something from the kitchen and crossed the hallway without difficulty. There was nothing on the recording that suggested she was about to fall. Ethan eventually came out of the office. Then 40 minutes passed. At the bottom of the staircase, my mother fell. I watched the footage again. Then again. There was no image of Ethan pushing her, no clear evidence that he had caused the accident, nothing that allowed me to turn suspicion into a fact. And that distinction mattered. I couldn't tell myself a story just because I was afraid of what the truth might be. But another truth was becoming harder to ignore. He did not cause the accident. He used it. That was the moment I understood what frightened me most. The fall had created chaos. My mother was unconscious on the floor. I was calling 911. The paramedics were coming. Everyone was focused on the emergency, and Ethan had already been inside her office. I kept watching. After Margaret fell, Ethan did not run toward her. He did not kneel beside her. He did not call for help. Instead, he looked toward the office. Then he walked back inside. I stopped the video. For several seconds, I just stared at the screen. Then I enlarged the image. His face became blurry. The details of the room became harder to see. But his hand was clear enough. He was carrying a small leather bag. My mother's bag. I knew it immediately. Margaret had carried that little brown bag for years. She kept important things inside and rarely let anyone else touch it. I looked at the timestamp. Then I looked at Ethan walking into the office. The same son I had spent years protecting was standing on a recording carrying something that belonged to his injured grandmother while she lay helpless downstairs. I did not know what was inside that bag. I did not know what Ethan had taken, and I still did not know what happened during those 40 minutes. But I knew one thing now. The fall was not where this story began. It was where I finally started looking. I kept thinking about the little leather bag. After I stopped the security footage, I went back to the hospital and sat beside my mother's room. She was still in surgery. Ethan was still in the waiting area. And for the first time, I was no longer looking at my son as the boy I had spent 27 years protecting. I was looking at the facts. Daniel and the forensic accountant began tracing my mother's accounts the next morning. They did not start with accusations. They started with dates, amounts, destinations, and records. The first number they showed me was $47,800. It had been transferred out of one of Margaret's savings accounts. I stared at the figure for a while. It was a lot of money, but somehow I still wanted to believe there was a simple explanation. Maybe my mother had authorized it. Maybe she had paid for something I didn't know about. Then Daniel placed another set of records in front of me. $214,000. That money had moved through 2 accounts connected to Ethan's company. I remember looking at the pages and feeling something inside me become very quiet. There was no dramatic revelation, no confession, just transactions, dates, account numbers, transfers, amounts that added up. Then came another investment account. $386,000 had been withdrawn. That was when the scale of it finally became impossible to ignore. But even then, the money was not the part that frightened me most. Daniel showed me records concerning my mother's house. It was worth approximately $1.86 million. Ethan had already started exploring a structure involving an LLC and a trust that could eventually place control of the properties somewhere else. Richard Pierce had helped him understand how such a structure could work. I sat there thinking about that house. It was not just a number on a property valuation. It was the place where I had spent my childhood, the kitchen where Margaret taught me to cook, the hallway where Ethan had once raced through the house as a little boy, the same staircase where my mother had been found bleeding on the floor. The house had been part of our family long before anyone had started calculating what it was worth. I asked when all of this had begun. The forensic accountant looked through his notes before answering. We found the first suspicious inquiries 72 days ago. 72 days. I repeated the number silently. Then another date came back to me. 81 days earlier, I had been sitting with Ethan at a restaurant after one of his business meetings. We had been talking about my mother and the changes I was making to her house. I had mentioned the current property market. I had told him, almost casually, that Mom's house was worth nearly $2 million now. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Why would I? He was my son. I had spent years talking to him about money, business, property, and opportunities. I never imagined that one sentence could become a number in someone else's calculation. But 72 days was only 9 days after that conversation. 9 days. That was the part I could not explain away. Ethan had not seen my mother fall and suddenly decided to take advantage of her. He had been looking into her assets more than 2 months before the accident. And that still left one question. Why had Margaret signed the power of attorney at all? Daniel kept digging. Eventually, he found something I had not known existed, a draft of another document. It had been prepared for Margaret to review. The draft did almost the opposite of what Ethan's power of attorney suggested. Margaret had intended to revoke the financial authority Ethan already had. She had planned to remove his access. She had planned to put stronger limits around her finances. And according to the notes attached to the draft, she intended to speak with me about it. I read that sentence twice. My mother had been trying to tell me something, not through a dramatic confrontation, not through a secret letter. She had been preparing paperwork, quietly, carefully, the way she handled most important things in her life. Then Daniel showed me the date. The day Margaret had planned to sign the new documents was the same day Ethan had come to her house. I looked at the date again. Then I looked at the security footage. Ethan arriving, Margaret still walking normally, Ethan entering her office, Ethan leaving, 40 minutes. Then the fall. Then Ethan looking towards the office instead of towards my mother. I had spent years believing I knew the difference between a mistake and a bad decision. Now I was learning there was another category: preparation. Ethan had not simply found an opportunity, he had been watching for one. And my mother had been trying to close the door just as he was preparing to walk through it. I still did not know exactly what happened inside that house that day, but I finally understood something I had refused to see. The fall had not created Ethan's plan. It had interrupted my mother's attempt to stop it. I had spent the previous day learning what Ethan had been doing behind my mother's back. Now I had to decide what I was going to do about my son. My first instinct was simple. I wanted to confront him. I wanted to walk into the hospital waiting room, put the power of attorney in front of him, and ask why he had been inside my mother's office. I wanted to ask why he had not called 911. Most of all, I wanted to ask why he had been more interested in her house than in whether she would survive. Daniel told me to wait. He wasn't suggesting some elaborate trap. He wasn't telling me to manipulate him into confessing. His concern was much simpler. If he's already lied once, don't give him a chance to destroy evidence. That sentence changed what I did next. Until then, I had been thinking like a mother. I wanted an explanation from my son. After that, I started thinking like someone who needed to protect my mother. I went back into the waiting room. Ethan was still there. He looked exhausted. Every few minutes, he glanced toward the doors where the doctors were working. I sat down across from him and told him the doctors expected my mother to need months of rehabilitation if she survived the surgery and recovery that followed. He nodded. Then he asked the question that I still remember more clearly than almost anything else from that night. What happens to the house? I did not answer. A few seconds later, he asked whether I was going to sell it. That was when something inside me finally settled. My mother was in surgery. She had fallen down a staircase, suffered a serious injury, and might spend months learning how to live independently again. And Ethan's first real concern was the house. Not whether she would walk again, not whether she was awake, not whether she was in pain. The house. I looked at him and understood something I had spent years avoiding. My son had learned to measure emergencies by what they might cost him, and I had helped teach him that lesson. So I did something I had never done before. I gave him the answer he expected from me. I told him not to worry because I would handle everything. He relaxed. I could see it happen. His shoulders dropped, his breathing changed, he put his phone away. Mom is still mom. That was what I imagined he was thinking. The woman who would make the phone calls, the woman who would find the money, the woman who would solve the problem before he had to face it. But this time, I did not solve anything for him. I did not transfer money, I did not sign a document, I did not give him access to my mother's accounts. I did not call anyone to clean up the consequences of his choices. I simply stopped interfering. From the outside, it probably looked like the old Evelyn. I was calm, I was available, I did not accuse him, I did not demand answers. But behind that calm, Daniel was coordinating with the forensic accountant, an estate attorney, and local investigators. They began preserving records and reviewing what had already been uncovered: emails, draft documents, bank transfers, communications involving Richard Pierce, messages involving Lauren. No one was declaring Ethan guilty before the evidence was complete. They were simply following the records, and the records kept leading back to the same people. Then they found a message from Lauren. It was short. It did not explain what had happened on the staircase. It simply revealed how she was thinking about my mother. Once Grandma's gone, the house solves everything. I read that sentence more than once. I thought about the house where my mother had lived for decades. I thought about the staircase. I thought about the little leather bag in Ethan's hand. And I thought about every time I had called my rescuing behavior love. I had spent years believing that if I kept opening doors for Ethan, eventually he would learn how to walk through them on his own. Instead, I had made sure he never had to learn what happened when a door closed. That realization hurt, but it also gave me something I had not had before: clarity. I didn't need to punish Ethan myself. I didn't need to threaten him. I did not need to become cruel. I only needed to stop protecting him from the consequences of his own choices. For years, I had confused forgiveness with permission. I had confused support with rescue. And I had confused being his mother with being responsible for the man he had chosen to become. I was still his mother, but I was no longer going to be his shield. That night, I closed the laptop and looked through the glass toward the hospital corridor. My mother was still fighting for her life. My son was still waiting for me to fix everything. And for the first time, I knew I wouldn't. I said the words quietly, mostly to myself. I'm done saving him. I knew about the party before Ethan mentioned it to me. The house belonged to my mother, but by then Ethan was treating it as if the future had already been decided. He had invited friends, business contacts, and people he hoped might invest in his company. The investigation was moving quietly in the background, and the authorities had already obtained the warrants they needed. They were preparing their own plan. I was not part of the arrest team. I was not pretending to be a police officer. I was simply going to the party. Ethan had decided to celebrate at the same house where my mother had been found at the bottom of the stairs. From what I understood, he was using the evening to convince people that his company was still moving forward. Money connected to my mother's accounts had helped him maintain that appearance. He had people around him who seemed willing to believe whatever story made the evening comfortable. When I arrived, the house looked almost normal. Music was playing, people were holding drinks, someone had placed flowers on the dining table. Ethan moved through the rooms like a host who had already won. He saw me near the entrance. "Mom, you actually came." "Of course." I kept my voice calm. I had dressed simply, a dark suit, comfortable shoes, nothing dramatic. I didn't want to look like someone arriving for revenge. I wanted to look exactly like what Ethan still believed I was, his mother. He was busy that evening. He introduced himself to a potential investor, talked about his company's future, and moved from one conversation to another with the confidence I had seen in him many times before. At one point, he told the group they were finally turning the page. He said it as if the past had already been settled. I watched him speak about the future while standing inside my mother's house. Then I noticed Lauren. She was wearing a piece of jewelry I recognized immediately. It had belonged to Margaret. I knew because I had seen my mother wear it for years. It was not something Lauren could have casually picked up at a store. I said nothing. I simply watched Lauren touch it while she talked to another guest. Richard Pierce was drinking nearby. Helen approached me and spoke about family, change, and moving forward. Her words were polite, but the meaning was clear. "You know, Evelyn, sometimes family has to move forward." I looked at her and answered, "Yes, sometimes it does." Then I walked away. A few minutes later, Ethan began talking about the property. He described it as part of his company's long-term plan. One of the investors asked whether he actually owned the house. He hesitated. He said it was complicated. I didn't interrupt. That hesitation told me more than a long explanation would have. The house was still my mother's property. The legal questions surrounding Ethan's attempted arrangement had not been resolved, yet he was already presenting it to other people as part of his business future. Then his phone rang. Not a call, an alert. He looked down. A transaction had been declined. He tried again. Declined. His expression changed. He opened another account and attempted to use another card. Declined. People nearby started noticing. Ethan stepped away from the group and tried another payment method. The same result. He checked his banking app repeatedly. I already knew what was happening. The accounts connected to the investigation had been restricted, and the bank's fraud team was blocking transactions while the authorities reviewed the suspicious activity. This was not a dramatic trick. No hidden men in black suits, no locked doors, no staged police performance. Just the ordinary systems Ethan had spent years assuming would always work for him, suddenly refusing to cooperate. He looked at me. For the first time that evening, he wasn't looking at me like his mother. He was looking at me like the person who had changed the rules. He came towards me. His voice was lower now. "Mom, what did you do?" I looked at him. I thought about the laptop I had replaced, the school problem I had fixed, the $18,400 I had paid, the $75,000 I had invested. Every time I had called another rescue an act of love. Then I looked around the room. The people who had come to celebrate, the house that was never his to claim, the jewelry that had belonged to my mother, and the accounts that no longer opened simply because he expected them to. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten him. I didn't explain what the authorities were doing. I only told him the truth. I stopped fixing things for you. That was all. The music was still playing, but nobody in that room looked comfortable anymore. The music had barely stopped when the front door opened. I remember that moment because nobody in the room seemed to understand what was happening at first. There was no shouting, no dramatic rush. No one came crashing through the house. A group of investigators entered calmly, followed by local officers. Their movements were controlled and professional. One investigator identified himself, then read the warrant, and explained that they were there to execute it and secure evidence connected to the investigation involving my mother's finances and property. For a few seconds, Ethan simply stared at them. Then he looked at me. "Mom?" I didn't answer. For years, whenever Ethan's life became difficult, I stepped in before he had to experience the full weight of his choices. That night, I didn't. Lauren was the first person to break down. She began crying and asking what was happening. Richard immediately started explaining that there had to be some kind of misunderstanding. His voice became faster as he tried to separate himself from the documents and financial arrangements we had already uncovered. But the investigators weren't there to debate with him. They had paperwork, they had dates, they had records, and they had followed a process that didn't depend on my anger. Dan Null had prepared the records, the questionable power of attorney, financial records, communications connected to the proposed trust and LLC, and forensic accounting findings. The security footage showed Ethan at my mother's house before the fall and entering her office afterward. It did not show him pushing her, and the investigation never pretended otherwise. That distinction mattered to me. I didn't want a story bigger than the truth. I wanted the truth to be enough. The investigators continued documenting the evidence. They had emails showing Ethan's interest in my mother's assets. They had communications involving Richard. They had financial transfers and records that showed money moving in ways that had nothing to do with my mother's care. They also had statements from people questioned during the investigation. One by one, the pieces Ethan had treated as separate problems formed one picture. He had not simply made one terrible decision after my mother fell. He had been preparing for an opportunity. The fall had not created the plan. It had given him a moment to use it. Then came the part I didn't expect. Ethan looked toward Lauren. I think he believed she would stand beside him. They had been involved together in the conversations about the house, the money, and what might happen once my mother could no longer make decisions for herself. But Lauren had already made a different choice. She had spoken with the prosecutor's office. She had been offered an opportunity to cooperate, and she had provided information that investigators had independently been working to verify. Among that information was a voicemail from Ethan. The investigator played it. His voice came through the room, unmistakably his. If Grandma can't change the paperwork, we're safe. Then the recording ended. Nobody spoke. I had heard Ethan's voice thousands of times. I knew his laugh and the impatient tone he used when he wanted me to solve something, but I'd never heard him sound like that. Not because the recording was angry, because it was ordinary. That made it harder to hear. There was no grand confession, no dramatic speech about stealing from his grandmother, just a sentence that showed he had already been thinking about what would happen if she lost the ability to change her own documents. I stood there and thought about my mother. I remembered the warning she had given me a year earlier. You don't help him anymore. You rescue him. At the time, I had defended him because that was what I had always done. He was my son. But standing in that room, I finally understood what my mother was trying to tell me. Love can become harmful when it removes every consequence, and sometimes protecting someone from the results of their choices is not kindness, it is simply another way of helping them continue. Ethan was placed under arrest. I watched without moving towards him. I didn't tell him that he deserved it. I didn't insult him. I didn't celebrate, because by then, the consequences belonged to him. As the investigators continued their work, the house became strangely quiet. The party was over. The drinks were still on the tables. Half-finished conversations hung in the air. The jewelry Lauren had been wearing was gone from her neck. I thought about the woman lying in a hospital bed because she had been left on a staircase instead of being helped. I thought about the son I had spent years trying to protect from failure. And I understood something painful. I had not defeated Ethan that night. He had reached that moment through his own decisions. I had simply stopped standing between him and the consequences. Before he was taken out, he looked at me one more time. I finally spoke. I hope one day you understand what you chose. Then he was gone, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to follow him. The arrest was not the end of the story. I wanted everything to become simple after Ethan was taken away. I wanted the truth to be clear. the consequences to arrive quickly, and the damage to finally have an ending. Real life did not work that way. The investigation continued for months. Prosecutors reviewed the financial records, the questionable power of attorney, the communications surrounding the proposed trust and LLC, and the evidence collected from my mother's home. Accounts connected to the investigation were restricted while the authorities examined the transactions. Money was traced, records were reviewed, assets that could legally be recovered were identified for possible restitution. Richard also had to answer for his role. He could no longer hide behind the idea that he had simply been helping with paperwork. Lauren cooperated with prosecutors, providing information about what she knew. Her cooperation affected how her own responsibility would be handled. Ethan's case did not end with a neat number attached to his name. He faced the possibility of years in prison and a substantial restitution obligation. I learned to let the courts decide the exact consequences. I had spent enough of my life trying to control outcomes. My job was different now. My job was to help my mother recover. Margaret survived the fall, but surviving was only the beginning. She needed surgery, physical therapy, and weeks of learning to trust her own body again. Standing without support became an exercise. Taking a few steps became an achievement. Getting in and out of a chair safely mattered. I drove her to appointments and helped rebuild her daily routine. Slowly, she started walking farther. When she was ready to leave rehabilitation, I brought her to a different house. It was smaller than her old one, filled with sunlight and close to the hospital. It wasn't impressive. That was exactly why I liked it. I sold the old house because I couldn't pretend it still felt like home. That house had stopped being a home. The sale wasn't about money. My mother didn't need another enormous property to prove she had survived. She needed safety, light, and a place where the stairs didn't remind her of the day everything changed. Months later, Margaret sat outside with a blanket over her legs. I placed coffee beside her. She asked whether I'd talked to Ethan. I said no. Then she asked whether I hated him. I looked across the yard. I don't know. That was the most honest answer I had. I didn't know whether I could forgive him. I didn't know whether forgiveness was something I even needed to decide. Margaret didn't push me. She reminded me that I didn't have to decide that day. Then she asked whether I regretted loving him. I didn't. What I regretted was teaching him that love meant never having to face consequences. Margaret said nothing. She simply held my hand. That was enough. I had spent years believing that being a good mother meant making sure my son never fell too far. I finally understood that sometimes a person has to face the full weight of their choices. That doesn't mean we stop loving them. It means we stop carrying them. When I returned to my interior design studio, a client asked why I had stopped accepting the biggest projects. I realized I didn't want to spend my life building bigger houses. I wanted to build a life I actually wanted to live in. My mother kept recovering. One afternoon, I came home and found her planting flowers near the porch. I put my bag down and joined her. There were no lawyers, no cameras, no expensive parties, no revenge speech, just my mother and me working in the soil. I once thought my greatest loss was my son. It wasn't. I lost an illusion that loving someone enough could protect them from every consequence, and that rescuing someone was the same as helping them. When that illusion disappeared, something else remained. My mother was alive. I was still her daughter. I was still a mother, and there was still a life ahead of me. This time, I wasn't going to build it around saving everyone else. I was going to live in it.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.